because I worked as a journalist in the Bay Area, a lot of people often wondered whether, how do you write fiction, because you think of it as two very different kinds of hats that you wear. And I was a little startled because some people were almost gently accusing and thinking, how come you write fiction? I think if you wrote a book of non-fiction that would be understandable, but fiction? And it made me think actually about it, and I would joke and say, well, I guess I'm sort of a closet fiction writer, but more than that, I realized that actually, because what I do really in radio, when I started out doing commentaries, is tell stories. For the commentaries were really about storytelling, and I'd always sort of been much more interested in not so much reporting on the ideology or the issue, but how to tell the story of that ideology or that issue through a character or something like that. And so for me, the reporting had always been about storytelling. So fiction was sort of an extension of that. It was storytelling, but I didn't have to be so grounded in facts. For me, the harder transition was, of course, that I came from a background which had nothing to do with writing or journalism. Well, I wrote, but I wrote software programs, so I wrote code, which didn't really count as writing in that sense. So I mean, I came to the U.S. like many other Indians, as a software engineer, and worked in Silicon Valley, which is how I ended up in California, and started writing on the side as a hobby almost, until one day I decided that I wanted to pursue this full time, and I was very lucky that I found organizations like New American Media, which were took the chance on somebody who really had no background or no degree that had anything. My degree was on dynamic load balancing algorithms for hypercubes, which for the life of it still exists. If you search, Google it, you'll find I even presented a paper about it in Phoenix, Arizona. But if you were to even ask me to give a summary of what that master's thesis was about, I would fail immediately. I don't even remember very well. But so, once I sort of made that transition, that was a very difficult transition for somebody of my background and my upbringing to make. And that was the one I did, people talk about being a closet fiction writer, that was the transition I was not telling anybody about. I told my sister, but I didn't tell my mother. I just said I had switched jobs. Not quite that I had switched careers. And then eventually, I still have told the story to other people before. My sister told me, I think you need to tell Ma. And because she was like, because I think she's getting a little suspicious. And I was like, why? But she said, no, because she asked me the other day, is he still in computers? And my sister, bless her heart, very carefully paused the truth and said, he still works with the computer. and so she was like, okay, I think this fiction is getting tissue thin right now, and we might as well come clean. And so I eventually told my mother, and she was stoic about it, I would say, kind of like, well, you know best. I mean, now you're an adult. This is. So she. But then she made her peace with it, and then once, and then what always helps is like some relative hears you on the radio or something and manages and tells you, it goes by the family grapevine, it reaches your mother, and then of course parents are very happy to take all credit for it and say like, oh yes, when he was a little boy, he was writing this and that and was editing the school magazine and stuff, and they're like, oh great. So once I did this, so I was telling the story because in many ways a lot of this book and writing this book came about out of a series of very lucky accidents. I did not set out to become a writer. That was not the trajectory planned for me. And I sort of deviated off course. As a friend of mine, I did an event at Berkeley recently, and a professor of sociology there, Rakari, was moderating the discussion. And Raka had known me since I was a little kid, because her brother and I were schoolmates together, and our fathers had actually also gone to school together. So we had this generational relationship. And Raka said, "Oh, you were the quintessential, what was known in Bengal as sort of the best boy. You were good in studies. You were this and she was like the annoying. It's a wonder I have any friends, because it was kind of like she would say, yeah, I remember my mother always would tell my brother, why can't you be more like him? And that horror, the bane of the existence of being the best boy. And then she said, but unlike many other best boys, you deviated from being a best boy, and you stopped being a best boy. You did things that you were not quite supposed to do. Becoming a journalist was sort of one of them. So then I started, so it was this series of happy accidents that brought me into journalism. I stumbled into doing a radio show called New America Now. That led to commentaries on NPR. I had no radio background. I had not even, I had done nothing with radio, and it was just things that I tried out here, and people who took a chance on me. And along the way, I met many writers, and I was writing some stuff on the side. And then 4 years later, I went to India, at that time originally for a year. And I took the sort of what I had written, the manuscript, with me, which nothing had happened with it until I went there. And again, by lucky chance, Bloomsbury in India, the publisher, editor there, read something else I had written in some other anthology, liked it very much, and asked me if I had other stuff. And I said, well, yeah, I've got this stuff that I've been puttering with. And she asked to see it. I sent her the first 3 chapters of the book. She really liked it. And then her boss in London liked it as well. And before I know it, Bloomsbury UK and USA and in India, they wanted to publish the book. And again, it was really a series of happy accidents that, in some ways I'm feel really, really lucky, because usually a book is published with the writer going and knocking on many, many doors and being rejected many, many times. And I sort of blundered into it almost, and and then I was freaked out, because I was just like, oh my God, it's happening. I don't know, is this right? Is this a good contract? And then a person who was an agent for many writers just told me, just chill. It's a good thing that's happened. Relax and go with the flow. So I went with the flow. I wanted to read you a little bit. This book, Don't Let Him Know, is a line from Alice in Wonderland. And it's a novel, but it's told in stories. So each chapter in this book is almost like a standalone story. So if you have a short attention span and just want to read, and just like the title of chapter 4, and you want to read chapter 4, you should be able to read it and not feel like you're missing any vital pieces of information. But if you read them in sequence, you will find, because they're all about the same people at different points in their life, you will find that they comment on each other, that the shadow of one chapter is cast on another chapter. And it's a book about family secrets. And so you will learn in the first thing about half a secret. You will learn what you think is a secret, but in the first chapter. But in the second chapter, you might realize that it was only half the secret, because secrets also have secrets. And this is about a good family, a happy family to all extents and purposes. Father, mother, young son. It's set in India, it's set in the US, in the Bay Area, all the places I've been and I know how to write about. And but it's about the fact that I feel like even happy family, actually not just even happy families, especially happy families have a lot of secrets. They're just better at concealing them than some others. And so This is about this family discovering each other's secrets, and some of them are traumatic secrets, and some are guilty pleasures more than secrets that you. And I want to read you a section which I would label as part of the guilty pleasures section, and it occurs early in the book where Romula, who is one of the lead characters in it, she has just arrived in California to live with her son, because the husband has her husband, his father, has died recently. And this is a common occurrence all over Silicon Valley, mothers coming to stay, widowed mothers coming to stay with a son or a daughter. And Romula has, like many Bengali widows, after her husband died, decided to give up eating meat and fish, like non-vegetarian. She's chosen a vegetarian diet. Nobody's forced her to do, but she's felt like that's the done thing. But once she's done it, she comes to America and she's a little bored in Silicon Valley, basically, because she's in some cul-de-sac in Silicon Valley, and just everybody goes off to work. And she watches TV all day, and she sees all these ads for fast food. And the burger ads look so juicy that she's stricken with this desire to have a burger, especially a McDonald's burger. So one day she sneaks out of the house and goes into, walks to the neighboring McDonald's. And it opens, so it's anyway, she's pushed open the door and walked in. Immediately she felt like she was really, finally, in America. Everything started to spin around her, but at the same time it all seemed to be moving extremely slowly. The restaurant rushed at her in a crazy plastic whirl of reds and yellows, and then receded into the walls of pale, muted pinks and greens. Rising up on all sides around her, formica and plastic were bathed in cheerful music, as if soaked in sunny syrup. Someone had left their tray on a table, and she watched a lonely matchstick of a fry sitting in a smear of ketchup. She heard children yelling and disembodied voices calling out numbers in Mexican accents. Two women unwrapped their burgers in front of her. One had a young girl who carefully ate a fry, dipping its head into a little white container of ketchup as thick as blood. She could smell it all, a dense, low-hanging smell of deep frying that left her both nauseous and ravenous at the same time. She looked at the confusing array of options on the menu board. Holy trinities of fries, burger, and soda beckoned to her. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, she thought, and chuckled to herself at the blasphemy. $4.89 for a combo? $5.29 for a combo? That was a lot of money, she said to herself. I thought these places were cheap. It took her a while to figure out the difference between the chicken sandwich and the chicken sandwich meal. She hovered at the edges, reading everything, squinting at all her options. She wished it explained what a McDouble was. The kitchen was a hum of activity. It moved briskly like a conveyor belt as people picked up their packets or trays of food and walked away. Giant baskets of fries emerged from vats of oil, plump and golden. Women with white gloves slapped dark brown patties on buns and smeared white mayonnaise with a rat-a-tat-tat rhythm, as if they had done this all their lives. Red digital numbers flickered and changed over, always going up and up and up. For a moment she wished June was there, that's her daughter-in-law, to help her navigate through this. But she knew they would never go there. Neither June nor Amit, her son, approved of fast food. Especially now that Amit wanted to be a chef, she thought. They tried to eat everything organic. Rhonda thought it was a ridiculous waste of money. She had no idea why anyone would pay more for those spindly, deformed cauliflowers when they could get those big, perfectly round ones for half the money. But she held her peace. She might be the cook, but it was not her kitchen. Every time they drove past a McDonald's, Romula would look longingly at the golden arches. They had come to Calcutta, she had heard, but she'd never been to one. To her, they seemed like the entrance to an exotic world. Every time they went out for dinner, Amit would say, "What do you want today, Ma? Chinese, Japanese, Thai, Mexican, or good old Indian?" And Romula would dutifully answer, "Whatever you like, dear. I don't mind. But she looked wistfully at the bright neon-lit procession of fast food places, forbidden and alluring, friendly sirens in the dark night, Taco Bell and Burger King and Pizza Hut. But McDonald's, she knew, was the king of them all. Neil, that's her grandson, was her only ally in these dinner expeditions. I want burgers, Mom, he might say sometimes, but he was easily overruled. Romola once thought of adding her vote to his, but was afraid she'd be accused of spoiling her grandson with junk food. Once they went to a cafe that served gourmet burgers. Romola wondered what one might taste like. Oh, they're really bad for you. And anyway, it's beef, said Amit as he ordered a skinless chicken sandwich for himself. Romola followed June's lead and got a spinach salad. She felt like a cow, she thought crossly when it arrived. A heap of green leaves with little specks of dark red cranberries and crunchy walnuts. What was this American obsession with chomping leaves? Now she looked nervously into her bag to make sure she still had her money and walked up to the counter. The woman behind the counter could not have been more than 18 years old. Romola noticed the big hoops in her ears, the perfectly trimmed bangs of her hair, the swatch of blue eyeshadow. Can I help you? Her bored voice sounded anything but helpful. Romola nodded and then took the plunge. She pointed at a burger on the menu but could not say anything. At the last moment she thought she would just get some fries or maybe the chicken sandwich. But then she felt that now that she was here, she had to have a burger. She knew it was beef and it would probably be revolting, but she had to have it. It was her only chance. A burger, that one, she pointed at the menu. With cheese or without, said the girl as if reading from a script. Romola shook her head. The girl looked at her quizzically and then moved on to her next line. The meal or just the sandwich? Just the sandwich. Romola had a little more confidence in her voice now. This might just work, she thought. Will that be all? Romola nodded. For here to go, said the girl. Romola stared at her, baffled. This was not a line she knew. There was nothing like that in the script she had carefully rehearsed in her head. For here to go, said the girl again. Romola suddenly became aware of other people in the restaurant. She craned forward, nervously clutching her half-open bag. The girl looked at her, her plucked eyebrow arched in a question mark. Romola felt her confidence starting to drain away. She felt like she had when she had first boarded an international flight by herself. She'd been convinced she had got on the wrong flight and was on her way to Australia instead of America. The questions and fears and worries bubbled in her stomach, but dried in her throat. She shook her head and stepped back. The girl was still looking at her. So was the man standing next to her. Yes, she said, hoping that was the right answer. For here to go, said the girl again, as if demanding a secret password, and Romola lost her nerve. Grabbing the handbag to her chest, she suddenly turned around and started walking as fast as she could towards the door. The girl said something else behind her back, but she refused to turn around and face that counter again. She walked past the trash can, its flaps swinging as someone emptied their tray in it. She walked past the children with their ketchup-stained faces. She waited for someone to grab her and turn her around and frog march her back to the counter. But no one seemed to even notice that she was there anymore. Her little order had sunk without a trace, like a stone in the pond, and life went on with not even a ripple to show for its brief, flickering existence. In this story, actually, this little chapter in a way there's a little sort of story behind the chapter because as a first-time writer, maybe all writers do this. You probably know better, but you steal from life, steal from your life, steal from incidents in other people's lives. Not the character. People ask you often, is Amit you? Is Romola so and so? None of the characters are entirely fictional, but attributes about them, incidents, are stolen, borrowed. And some of this story, this chapter, the genesis of it, actually came out of when my parents were visiting me in California, and I, like Amit in this chapter, was trying to take them to, the Korean barbecue and the Vietnamese place and Thai or whatever. And at one point, my mother somewhat sheepishly asked, can we go to McDonald's? And I was like, what? You want to go to McDonald's? She's like, yeah, I've heard so much about it, and this is, it was in the 90s, it hadn't yet arrived in India. And I finally was like, okay, well, we're going to drive down to LA to go to Disneyland, of course. And on the way, we will stop at a McDonald's. I had thought we would stop, at that time, the ritual of going down to LA was to stop at In-N-Out Burger, because that was not there in San Francisco yet. But then my mother was like, In-N-Out, what is that? That sounded, she thought it was like I was fobbing her off with some cheap knockoff instead of going to the real McDonald's. So we just went to the real McDonald's and had a burger, and she was like, oh. And it was, obviously then you're very disappointed with the burger because it looks nothing like the picture, and it's much flatter. In the picture it's like big and round and juicy, and this like flat thing came as if it had been in somebody's luggage and come out somewhat cracked. But at least she had her burger and she had the fix. So some of this story came out of that incident, and that it was kind of fun to do this in this book, because it allowed me to, people have said writing is an act of remembering, and it allowed me to actually remember some of these things. And there is a character in here of a great-grandmother, and I was lucky enough to know my great-grandmother till I was about 14 or 15 when she died, and she was well into her 90s. And it was lovely to recall her voice again in trying to give voice to the great-grandmother in the story, whose story is not the story of my great-grandmother, but the image of her that I have, the voice. It's like a voice you haven't heard for a very long time, but in the process of writing it, you sort of heard it again. That was a real pleasure in terms of doing the book. But to ask you guys if you have any questions or...
I have a question, Sandip. What's the significance of this
cover? The cover. The significance of this cover is that there are no mangoes in it.
There are no cars, and there's only one person also.
Yeah, I'll tell you this. I'll show you the cover for the Indian version. This is the Indian cover, actually.
Oh,
yeah. So the US wanted their own cover, and honestly, the cover I've heard from other writer friends is sometimes the most traumatic part of the book, because you sort of have some amount of veto, but you don't have real say in it. And especially when you're a writer from a hyphenated identity, it becomes trickier because you're dealing with a certain, marketing and all of that. And friends would say like, oh, just pray that you don't get the headless woman in a sari cover. You neck down and you see the sari. You just push for the entire woman. And so we actually struggled with the cover a bit, because I wanted a cover that was reminiscent of, if it was going to be about India, if it was going to be something Indian, it had to be something around Calcutta. And many of the initial images that we came up with didn't work, because sort of when you're just sort of trying to find images of India, either you end up with Rajasthan, and which has very different architecture, very different kinds of way people dress, or you end up with this, in Calcutta, a lot of stock images push you into sort of city of joy territory, so you see sort of slums and the rickshaw puller and things, none of which are really, my book is not about those things. It's about a much more middle class Calcutta. And so eventually they came with this picture, which is from a South Calcutta sort of neighborhood, which is a vanishing thing in Calcutta. Now, these sort of leafy neighborhoods with those little two-story houses on either side, which is really the sort of neighborhood I grew up in, are disappearing because those houses are being torn down, and they're not regarded as heritage in any way, as like the old mansions of North Calcutta. Some of them might be regarded because nobody famous lived or was born there, but now that they're disappearing and being turned into apartment buildings, you also realize how much they gave a neighborhood a certain character and a certain warmth and grace, actually, a certain kind of graciousness, which is, now it's becoming a very different sort of neighborhood. So in a way, this thing is sort of, I liked it because it was a kind of a different sort of Calcutta. It didn't have a bridge, it didn't have black and yellow taxis or a rickshaw puller. And in a way, because the title, even though it's not clear from the cover, obviously, the title is taken from Alice in Wonderland. It had that little Wonderland character, like somebody almost dreamily, there's a figure on it, sort of dreamily walking into a dream, but mostly I was just happy it wasn't the headless one. Yes.
So you talk about happy accidents. I think you have some talent that earned them, but I wonder also if you think the interest of publishers in your work has something to do with the significance of the Indian immigration to America.
Yes. Of course, there is.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of interest. That's why there are so many Indian diasporan writers, in America. Somebody often would joke to me that if you go and take the subway in Brooklyn, you always fall upon an Indian writer because they all seem to be living in Brooklyn. But it's a sort of a double-edged sword as well, because there is also there's both a lot of interest and there's a lot of fatigue too. Where you feel like, like someone like, say, a Jhumpa Lahiri is around, and you feel like, well, she has written so beautifully and so award-winningly about the Indian immigrant, especially a Bengali immigrant experience. So then if you write a book that goes into some of that same territory, it's immediately sort of said, well, there's already Jhumpa there who's written it, so do we need another book? Even though obviously nobody says that about, nobody ever says that, John Updike wrote about the Rabbit trilogy set in the suburbs of New Jersey, so we can't do any more books about suburban New Jerseyites. But so I think it is absolutely true that because of the large amount of Indian immigration to the US and stuff, Indian writers writing in English have a lot of currency here. But it is also true, I know a lot of Indian writers who face a lot of roadblocks for that very same reason, where they feel like, there are already so many out there. What are you doing that's new? How is it different? So, and honestly, this book, I don't know if it would have, perhaps it would have been published had I been in America, but in some ways, even though much of it was written in San Francisco, its publishing happened because I went to India, and a publisher in India really liked it and championed it and fought for it, and then it sort of became a worldwide thing, but it sort of originated in India as opposed to being published in the US and then being pushed out into the rest of the world, which I think is kind of cool that it's working both ways right now.
So you've written your first novel. Are you going to continue writing fiction? Or?
I actually have I was signed for a 2-book deal with the second book that was unspecified. Now and then my publisher sort of gently says, thought about the second book yet? Mm-hmm. And I was at the Jaipur Literature Festival just last month, and I was moderating a panel, and there was some question had come up about books and first books and things like that. And I just sort of casually said, because you put so much of yourself in that first book, because you don't know whether you'll ever write anything again. You have no idea if it's going to be published either, but it's like you cram everything into that first book and it's very special in that way. And I said, like, I mean, I just published my first book and I have a 2-book deal, but luckily my publisher is not sitting here, but honestly, I can't say guarantee that there will be a second. Who knows if there will be a second book? I would like there to be a second book, but who knows? Minutes later, I got a text message saying your publisher was here. So I do, but I don't know if the second book will be fiction. Honestly, when I went to India, I was sort of mulling the idea of a non-fiction book. And the fiction sort of happened before it. So I may go back to, there are some ideas that I've been mulling over in terms of nonfiction, to sort of, that kind of memoir, not memoir, but memoir reportage combination sort of. So that is something but don't hold me to it. I may well see it. I just know it won't be a book of poetry. I have no talent for that. So, but whatever happens, I feel immensely grateful because first, not until I came on this book tour and went to events, and then I was like very frazzled because I was dealing with all the the logistics of a book tour and trying to line up this media and wondering why your interview with NPR has not aired yet, and trying to call and do all that stuff. And then at one moment I suddenly sort of paused. It was at the first reading I was doing at Kepler, and sort of finally relaxed, and then I finally suddenly like really enjoyed that moment. And then somebody who said, that is the first book. You may write many books, but you will never have a first book again. And that unadulterated, the surprise of that first book, you just put it out there not knowing even that you had a book in you. And that is something worth savoring, because it is a lovely feeling. I didn't quite expect it, but it was.
I have a couple questions. I'm really I'm interested that you finished the book once you had returned to your home, and I'd be interested in hearing you reflect on whether the distance and the departure and the homebound journey, the homecoming, I should say, gave you some sort of freedom or perspective to be able to finish the book. And then I'm really interested that you said that most of it was written in San Francisco, and I wonder if in your mind you were writing for an American audience, and you feel some responsibility to explain India to them, to explain some slice of that Indian book. And what responsibility do we have as writers from certain communities to translate for a non-Indian audience, for example, what that life is like? Yeah,
so those are very interesting questions, because like having interviewed people, writers, and like those things that all writers have tussled with here. And often we say we write with no audience in mind, which is both true and not true. I mean, I think at some level we do have some kind of audience in mind. But I'll answer the question about distance first. And I don't think this book would have been possible if I had not left India. And I don't think this book would have happened if I had not gone back to India. If both parts of the journey were needed. And it would not have been possible for the simple reason is I could have probably been a software engineer sitting in India. And in a way, I jumped ship and changed careers because in America that seemed like not such a taboo thing to do. I had a lot more people around me who had done it, and so I could sort of follow. But the distance was very important because I think a lot of this book is set in India rather than set in the US. but it's a certain it's a certain slice of India. It's India in a certain time period in the 70s and so, and being away from it actually allowed me to remember it with a certain clarity that would have been difficult had I been sitting in India itself at that point of writing, because so much has changed in India that it's, even when you're there, it's hard, it's difficult to remember what all has changed. And it's kind of like when you go to a street and you see this new shop and you're like, oh, that's new, and then you can't remember what was there before it, but this one is new, but so I often have that kind of feeling in India now, because so much has changed, and it was somewhat the distance from India that allowed me to write about India, but then I sort of had to go back to ground the book in the reality, because the book eventually comes to contemporary India, and then on that reverse journey, it allowed me to remember San Francisco and write about remember coming to the U.S. for the first time to a small town and things. So that distance actually worked and helped me both ways. And in terms of the explaining. Yeah, I mean, so when I was writing it, I worked with this writers group in San Francisco, and there wasn't much explaining to be done, because I think one good thing, and this goes to your question about a lot of Indian American writers, is a lot of people have broken ground before me. So I don't feel that responsibility as acutely as, say, Bharati Mukherjee or Chitra Divakaruni would have when they started writing, and they were literally writing some of the first books talking about the Indian immigrant story. And so you sort of somewhat relieved from that burden of representation, and you can just focus on writing characters without thinking about whether that character is embodying 1 billion Indians out there. So my book, for example, even deals, one of the secrets in the book is around sexuality. One of the characters who has, he is gay, has basically, unable to deal with it, and without any support structure, he gets married, and so that is one of the big secrets in it. And even writing that character, I didn't feel like, oh my God, now this character will be how an Indian gay man will be perceived or judged, because there have been other characters now in Indian American fiction who are gay or bisexual, including Manil Suri's recent book City of Devi. So I feel like a little freer to just treat them as characters and not worry about the kind of image they are putting out for the Indian American community. And I was lucky in that because I think the original editor was in India, there was less pressure to do a lot of the explanations. And the way, this I had no idea, the way book publishing works right now is the original edit from wherever it happens is actually the real master edit. So it happened in India, and the US basically took the Indian edit. They may have had some other questions that they added to it, but I was expecting I would spend hours, changing spellings, or changing lift to elevator and footpath to sidewalk and things, and none of that happened. So if you read the book, you will find the entire book is actually in British spelling, even though it's being sold in America. Mm-hmm. And if it had originated in America, it would have sold in India with American spellings, which is, I think, great. Mm-hmm. Other question? Yes.
Why did you? I can imagine your stories are told a lot through your family.
Yeah.
And here, you were maybe freer because you didn't have your family around, but then you didn't have your family around. You're in India, you have your family around, but maybe you're not so free. Why did you go back to India?
Family.
For family.
Well, partly. I mean, my mother was older and unable to really travel to make that sort of really long journey. Right. But there was no pressing need to go back. My sister lived there, and my mom lived with my sister, so it wasn't like she was alone or anything like that. But I felt like, I had not been there when my dad passed away. I was here, and I felt that I wanted to be around closer to family a little bit, not because I'm particularly useful at anything. I mean, like they have their system down pat. You know, my sister last year, my sister came to the U.S. to visit my niece who was studying in New York, and so my mother was actually left in my tender mercies. And my mother was in a state of panic. She barely ate the whole 3 weeks that were gone because she was afraid she would get sick or something, and then then she would be dependent on me to figure out treatment and doctors and this and that. So she was just like, it was almost like by the time after 3 weeks when my sister came back, my mother finally exhaled and she was like, okay, now I can eat. And here I was thinking like, oh, we'll have a good bonding time and eat this, eat that. And I said, no, I mustn't eat that because I might get a stomach upset, I might do this. But it's a psychological thing. At the same time, it does make the family happy. I mean, my sister could, for one, come to America for 3 weeks without worrying about, who was going to take care of my mother. And it's just a psychological thing to just have family closer. We're a very small family, and it was nice to be closer to them. The writer Vikram Seth had told me years and years ago because he had moved back after the success of Golden Gate, and he moved back he was at Stanford, and he moved back to Delhi, and he said he moved back because he felt like living in California was like swimming in a very warm pool, and you do lap after lap after lap, and then one day you get up and 20 years have passed. and he said, I didn't want that to happen to me with my family. I didn't want to go back because you got a dreaded phone call and it was an emergency, a parent had a stroke or something. He said, I wanted to go back at a time, this is like he said this maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I wanted to go back and be able to, sit down with my father and have a whiskey every evening. And, good for him. His father, who's in his 90s, is still around, and they still sit down every evening at 6:30 and share a glass of whiskey together. I mean, it's become their ritual, which I think is lovely. And the other reason I wanted to go back other than family was I had lived here for 20 years. I love the Bay Area. I mean, every time I come back, it's just, I really love coming back. But I felt like there was a lot of change that was happening in India, and as a writer and a journalist, it felt a more exciting place to be. I had not reported or worked in India very much, and I thought I wanted to try doing that and telling stories from there. I'd done a lot in the Bay Area already, so it felt more challenging and interesting. So I went for a year, it's been 4. So we'll see.
For a year.
Yeah, but I say when you say the same fiction and lie when you come to the US, you say like, oh, I'll work for 2 years and then go back to India. Say every immigrant says that, and then before you know it, they've been here 25 years.
An NPR question. Did you pitch them about, okay, I'm going to be going back to India and I could report stories? I mean, did you actually pitch that, or?
Yeah, no, I told them that, and they were open to it. I mean, that's also a very lucky thing because, NPR has their own correspondent in India. So it's not like they need particularly another correspondent. But because I had done commentaries for Morning Edition for so many years and had a certain familiarity with it, they were happy to entertain stories, pitches from India. It's hard, I have to say it is hard to, NPR does far less commentaries now than it used to when I started. At that time, I was doing a lot of commentaries for them. And even when I went back to India, the first year I did a lot of commentaries, but then after that they had a lot of cutbacks, and they basically just do far fewer commentaries. The woman who used to be my editor in Palo Alto left, and she's starting her own thing and moved on. And so, and this last year I've done only 3 or 4 for the National Morning Edition, and it's because they do far fewer, and they've also become far shorter. I used to do 5-6 minute ones. Now it's like, can you do it in 3.5? And they're like, oh, is it say? And that's where sort of the explaining question comes in, because in NPR you do have to do a certain amount of explaining, and And if you're like trying to, do a story which requires, and if you only have 3.5 minutes to do, by the time you explain something, your time is gone. It's over. So that's become a bit of a challenge. But I'm lucky I also have KLW here, which asked me to do like a weekly letter from India that they air, and KLW gives me absolutely free reign to about the topics I want and what I want to talk about. So that's wonderful. So.
Anyone else?
Yes, I would like to
Yeah.
ask a question. Have you been exposed to the contemporary Asian art scene, which has been developing for 30 years?
In all over Asia, or you mean here or in Asia?
It is published in Hong Kong for 30 years and has been distributing around the world.
Ah.
Very little PR has been attended to for North America.
I obviously, because I wasn't really.
And the level of visibility, 20 years ago, I've designed 5-star hotel presidential suites where I needed to find local art in a dozen Asian countries and
Yeah.
found contemporary Asian art.
Wonderful. Yeah,
And
no,
it
I
has a level of visibility which would be a phenomenal support system.
yeah, and there's a lot of
Or
stuff.
dance,
Yeah,
yeah,
it looks gorgeous.
and it also has the world sculpture, so there's a 3-dimension also developed very, very
Interesting.
dynamically.
Yeah, I don't know. See, I learn new things every day.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.